cognition and evaluative feelings. As usual, I'm trying to pack as much meaning into just the little title names here. So, just recapping, we've done the physiological component of emotions. We've done the behavioral or expressive component of emotions, the reflex-like way that we betray our emotions on our face. So with that covered, all that's left is the cognitive component. The judgments that we make that cause emotions to trigger in us versus how experiencing an emotion causes your cognition in itself to bias and change so that you'll act in a certain way. I describe it this way because in addition to the word cognition, your emotions are evaluative feelings, and we're focusing a lot on that evaluative component right now, the judgments that you make. So let's touch back a little bit here on Schachter's two-factor theory. Now, when we were talking before about this idea that emotions are not illogical and that's an uncharitable way to think about emotions, when we think about Schachter's two-factor theory and that notion that we can misattribute our affect, if the dawning to us of our emotion is uncertain, if we have to interpret our context to figure out what emotion we're feeling when we have a particular level of physiological arousal, that is largely because, again, like I said, as is described by Schachter's two-factor theory, there are two pathways that we use for this. There's a fast pathway and a slow pathway for triggering an emotional experience from some evaluation in the environment. And effectively, one of them has a big cognitive component, has a lot of thinking and a lot of judgment involved with it, and the other one doesn't. So all emotions are triggered by some circumstance in the environment. They're triggered by you paying attention. You have some object of attention that inspires a certain judgment in you, and particular judgments map on to particular emotional states. And then depending, again, on how much you're focusing on it and how much you allow yourself to think about the judgment that you've just made, that will effectively determine whether you're using the fast pathway or the slow pathway. If you want to visualize that quickly, when we talk about the way that this is going to affect us, again, emotions change your behavior in real time. They're all about guiding your actions and your immediate judgments in real time. So there's going to be a correspondence that we're going to be making here between why an emotion gets triggered and what, on an evolutionary level, your body is expecting you to do about it as it comes along here. But again, looking at the two-factor sort of model of this, how we can be confused along the way, the fast pathway is a purely limbic pathway. It runs between the thalamus and the amygdala, and when we have that kind of initial response to an emotion, we usually actually experience that as surprise initially. We make a judgment, its emotional relevance is clear, we start to get this arousal of emotional experience, and then we have to sort of go from there. If the context is very, very clear, or if it's hitting us in a very, very intense way, the emotion will immediately dawn on us. But more often than not, again, we'll experience a general version of that fast pathway, and then the slow pathway has to kick in, where it runs through the cerebral and sensory cortex. And we consult our memories and context and reasoning along the way to figure out what is the appropriate way to feel in this setting. Can I think more about this? Is everything what it appears to be? This is why we have the two-factor approach. The fast response allows you to start mobilizing your body for an emotional response as soon as it seems like one is going to become relevant, but the slow pathway allows you to, when it's possible, when it's necessary, to think in greater depth about what emotion is the appropriate one to feel right now by doing a little bit more of a complicated judgment, a cognitive judgment about what your situation is. Now, again, that's all very ephemeral. It's not going to make sense unless I give you some examples. So I've pulled out all of the bad ones of the 5 basic emotions. I got rid of joy just because everyone understands joy, and it's more relevant to what we were talking about last week. The main circumstance under which you experience joy or happiness is when you wanted something and you get it. Extrinsic reward in and of itself, that hinges on the emotion of joy and the response that gives us. But let's talk about the bad ones. There's way more bad emotions than there are good emotions, and we'll look at some of the ones from that are the 5 basic ones here. And what I'm pairing up here is the judgment that you need to make in order to experience this emotion, what triggers that emotion, and what, on a cognitive bias and a behavioral level, that same emotion primes you to do. And when I put those two things side by side with each other, you'll start to see what the underlying evolutionary logic of every one of these emotions is. Anger. Anger is the emotion that we feel when we judge that we have been wronged. So, anger isn't just that something bad has happened, but when you feel, things shouldn't be this way, that person owed me something and didn't give it to me, or someone who I trusted has betrayed me, or a system that I rely on is not performing the way it should and I'm suffering the consequences, These are the circumstances under which we feel anger. We feel like we have been wronged. And what does anger do? Anger primes us to aggressively punish other people. That's anger is what makes us feel aggression primarily. We usually have quite strong inhibitions on wanting to hurt other people, but they drop enormously when we experience anger, and all of a sudden it's a live option to want to shout at somebody or punch them in the face or something like this. And that doesn't make a lot of sense. Anger gets us into a lot of trouble in the modern world, unless you remember that for most of human evolutionary history, there were no police. There was no government, there was no state that would intervene when something would go bad for you. If somebody wronged you, your only recourse was for you and the people that care about you to get angry and punish them, to disincentivize them from ever treating you poorly in the future. That's a mode of deterrence. That deterrence is the underlying logic of why anger works the way that it does. So, I mean, once you see that, that's how they pair up. It's a bit of an evolutionary mismatch in modern terms that, anger tends to get us in trouble more often than it doesn't because we're supposed to trust the police or the state or something like this. But for most of evolutionary history, anger is what allowed you to survive because people wouldn't take advantage of you. Fear. Fear is the emotion that we feel when we judge that we are in immediate danger. And what does fear prime us to do behaviorally? Well, it primes us to be highly vigilant and evasive. If you think of what somebody who is very afraid looks like, they tend to be kind of twitchy and jumpy. They have wide eyes and things like this because fear primes you to scan your environment as best as you can for any sources of danger, and if possible, get away from them, or get away, hide, run, or be at least in a position where they can't hurt you as best as possible. Sadness. Anyone who's seen the movie Inside Out, the whole purpose of that movie is about how lay people don't understand what the purpose of sadness is. I was an insufferable person to see the movie Inside Out with, just because I already know this stuff as a psychologist. When Joy in the movie Inside Out was yelling at sadness and saying yelling at the others about sadness, being like, why is she even around? Like, what is she good for? It's such a bad emotion. I remember leaning over to my wife and saying, well, the function of sadness is that it's the emotion that we feel when we've lost something, and it primes us to withdraw activity from whatever's not working out for us and signal for help. And that is ultimately the conclusion they come to in the movie as well. But that really is the underlying logic. Sadness is an embarrassing emotion to feel. We tend to cry, or we show it on our face. We don't want to admit weakness to other people. But how do you feel when somebody that you care about expresses sadness? Again, we have a visceral, caring response to it. If you care about someone and they are sad, you want to do anything that you can to help them. That's the underlying social function of sadness. It's triggered when you have lost something, or you've lost an important prospect or something you cared about. You withdraw your activity in order to reassess what you're doing with your life, and you signal for help. You cry, you look sad and things like this. So anyone in the environment who is sympathetic to you will come and help. In fact, sadness as an emotion, you see this a lot in small children, modulates based on how much we think receptive people are in the environment. Children who fall off jungle gyms and scrape their knees and things like this sometimes don't even bother to cry unless they know that there's somebody nearby who'll come and help them if we do. Because, again, even though we don't necessarily understand it consciously, the logic of sadness is it's the emotion we feel when we've lost something. It causes us to withdraw activity and signal for help. And last one there is disgust. Again, when do you feel disgust? It's the emotion you feel when you've been exposed to something sickening or corrupting. That's why most of us feel disgust when exposed to anything that has pathogens in it that can make us sick. Feces, vomit, blood, guts, all this kind of awful stuff. We have a visceral response to it because it could make us very sick, especially in a world with no doctors and no antibiotics, as for most of human evolutionary history. What does disgust do to us? It primes us to both avoid whatever it is we're disgusted with and to expel things from our mouth. When you are disgusted, you go, ugh, and things like this. You spit things out. If you're sufficiently disgusted, you gag and start throwing up and things like this, because if you've been exposed to something contaminating, that's much safer than not throwing up. But that's the underlying logic here. Our emotions are reactions to these circumstances. They are right most of the time, at least for our evolutionary history. They're a good one-size-fits-all solution to, if this thing happens, this is what you should be doing. Hence the cognitive evaluation versus the cognitive biases and how they fit together. Although, again, because emotions are the basic control system for our bodies, they react to even the simplest of stimuli. Things that we know are fictional, or worries that we have that we know are speculative, still trigger our emotions in the same way, because it's a more basic system than our ability to abstractly reason. That's the main notion of evolutionary mismatch. What our emotions prime us to do are designed for an environment that we simply don't live in anymore. You get angry and you start choking somebody who has wronged you, you're likely to go to jail for it. That's a mismatch between the conditions of the past and the conditions of now. On top of this, we, live in a world where we forecast, like, oh, what am I going to do about my mortgage in the future? I'm so worried about the prospect of losing something important to me. I'll experience an enormous amount of anxiety that I wouldn't have experienced in the Pleistocene epoch or in human evolutionary history, just because those kinds of stimuli, the modern stimuli, did not exist. We'll talk about that more later on in the semester, but for now, again, that's the main idea. Your emotion is a canned response to a particular stimuli in the environment. It's to give you a right, more often than not, heuristic response. So next up is the crossover between emotion and motivation. We'll start talking about how emotion expression varies between cultures, and I'll see you then.